Good afternoon, world. It's Sean here on another episode of The Real Politic. So I don't think I've done a video for a very long time. This channel might be called The Real Politic, but the real life certainly gets in the way of you doing an internet YouTube channel. So I thought I'd get back on the horse, as it were, back a bit of walking and talking, because there's been so much politics. Oh my goodness, the politics, the politics, the politics, the politics. Goodness me, the politics. Goodness me, the politics. Right, let's get started. So walking and talking, we'll do three main topics. The second of them are probably a bit more linked, sort of cause and effect. But firstly, I think the first one we'll talk about is the possible disunited kingdom that we're going to have at the end of spring here in the UK. Secondly, I think we'll talk about sort of, the Trump administration playing real life command and conquer and their sort of scattergun approach to whatever they're doing. And thirdly, maybe a smaller topic with a bit more potential rather than real facts on the ground, but will Europe be made great again? So, firstly, the politics, right. Firstly, so as we talked about in the autumn and winter, there is regional English elections and Scottish Parliament and Welsh Senate elections in the 7th of May. So that's, as we are recording now, that's just over 6 weeks to go. Okay, so there's a couple of things that really might be quite seismic here. So there's been a lot of, the sound bites have been dominated a lot by, well, what we'll talk about later, but Trump's new Gulf War and various other madness that's been happening, really, in the kind of the spillover of the magosphere into, like, the rest of sort of real planet Earth. But if in the UK we've got, so Welsh elections, Scottish elections, English regional elections, but it's going to be a big deal for the UK government and the parties that are jostling for position, because, well, obviously I'm Scottish, but in Wales, Labour have been in power in Wales since devolution. So since the turn of the century, Labour have been the people to go to there. And much like across the rest of the UK, reform had been on the rise in Wales. But there's been a few things that have robbed them of momentum. Generally, probably it's a lot of the tone of a lot of their policies. They've had a few sort of slip-ups and things that just generally sound pretty nasty. But I think that a common one that a lot of people will know of is of the former Reform leader in Wales being outed as a mouthpiece of the Kremlin. So that was some time ago, but it still leaves a bit of a nasty stench across some of what Reform might want to do there. So, and I think that as well, with the rise of Reform, I've kind of touched on this before, but it's a curious thing, the rise of Reform in Wales, in Scotland. Northern Ireland politics are a little bit different, but we'll touch on a wee bit of that in a second. But with Reform come across as, they say that they're Reform UK, but when you really break it down, they're English nationalists. So I see that the polling numbers today look like Reform has dipped a bit in the polls in the run up to the Welsh election, and the people who are the sort of the fast runners in this election, the ones that the polls are backing just now, is Plaid Cymru. So the Welsh National Party, the Party of Wales as they call themselves, and that would be quite a momentous change, because just a few years ago they only had a handful of seats in the Senate. They were not, they had a voice, but they weren't particularly prominent. Labour being the dominant force, particularly on the left. The Conservatives obviously having more of a voice. I think Reform will supplant them quite successfully. But it looks to me like Plaid Cymru might be within a shout of controlling the Senate, which would be massive. That's quite seismic, not just in Wales, but across the UK. And because that would be seismic in its own right, okay? But I think it's going to link closely into another couple of things. One thing that didn't get really talked about, and I can see why people say this, I'm not I always get a little bit of a twitchy eye when people say that they don't trust the mainstream media, all this kind of thing. You've got to take your information from different, like, so I've got 2 young kids, so I don't always get the chance to, but if I get the chance to in the morning, I'll eat my breakfast with a different sort of breakfast show on every morning. I'll sometimes put on BBC, ITV. I've even watched like the likes of GB News. It's more a propaganda channel really, but or Al Jazeera, Fox News, like anything really. So I think that you need to take in, you can listen to like good journalism, live reporting, some facts, some bullshit, and sort of blend it all up together and see what comes out. And I think that people really need to be more critical in their appraisal of things like that. But one thing that I don't think that does get covered very much in the sort of mainstream British media is that Sinn Féin have been the largest party in the Northern Ireland Assembly since 2024. And I think that's quite a big change. There's a lot of demographic stuff there as well. So, Northern Irish viewers, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that traditionally there was more of a larger unionist vote population generally that associated with that. Now, I'm not coming down on either side of it, but I've got my my thoughts on where the UK is going in the future. But you could end up with Plaid Cymru being the dominant party in Wales, a Sinn Féin Northern Ireland. They share the First Minister and Deputy First Ministers, sort of share some responsibilities there. And then in Scotland, you've had the SNP, the Scottish National Party, being forming the government since 2007. So that's almost 20 years of SNP. And then we've got the continued rise of reform in England, although polls across the UK actually show them dipping a bit. They might have peaked. So, hypothetically, if we can speak, so after May, if you end up having Plaid Cymru governed or strongly influenced Wales, a Sinn Féin being the largest party in Northern Ireland, and the SNP as a majority, or with a kind of vote supply agreement with the Greens, which they also favour independence in Scotland. Is that still a United Kingdom? So I'm not 100% sure that it is. And that's coupled with the rise in reform of English nationalists in England. So now, I'm not saying that nationalism is generally a force for good, I think, but it just goes to show deep divisions. And now, I don't live in Wales, I don't live in Northern Ireland. In Scotland, there's a general consensus that the way things are done down south doesn't really have the same feel to it as it would be done up here, for instance. I think people are a little bit sort of more socially minded. And interestingly, I was talking to my other half, who's actually English, and she was saying yesterday that she's not a big politics person, but she does have a good think on it. And she brought this up, the fact that the elections are coming up, and asked if I thought there'd be another independence referendum. And I said I wasn't sure yet, but she was saying that she feels that people in Scotland, so her being English, travelling down to see relatives every now and again, and she kind of feels that people in Scotland feel more European than they feel British. And I think that's certainly rings true with me. I think in the last independence referendum, we were told to stay within the EU, you have to remain in the UK. Well, that worked out, didn't it? Yeah, so that was a good one. And then I've mentioned this quote before, but Nigel Farage, I've heard him saying it a couple of times about that time we'd had enough of the Scottish tail wagging the English dog. Now, none of this, hopefully you can see, having family that are English. I go to England all the time. I love it. It's a great place. I think they should probably change their national anthem so that's something that reflects the people and the sort of the qualities of England, rather than focusing on one family. But I think it just shows the divergence of social attitudes and general identity. I think that, and with identity, I'm not talking about Iron Brew and bagpipes and sort of Morris dancing and things like that, like pies in England. It's more about what your intrinsic values. And I think that inherently most people are good people, but I think that it's just a divergence of where people want social policy to go in different countries. I think that that's what I see driving it in Scotland. I think more than independence, I think people feel disappointed with the way that things have went in the last few years. Brexit has been an absolute economic disaster. You can call me biased on that if you like. The facts back that up. I think pushing through basically what was a no-deal Brexit at the height of the COVID pandemic was a complete economic disaster. I think the worst predictions were that it shaves something like 6% off of GDP. That's combined with 4% with Brexit, plus 2% of GDP with the COVID pandemic. But the figures are saying it's actually worse than that. It's closer to 8%. And we can feel that, I think everybody feels a bit less well off than they were just 5 years ago. So if you've got Scotland returning the SNP and the Greens to power, which I think is quite likely, I predicted in October, I thought that the SNP would form a minority government. I still think that's the case. I don't think that they will form a majority. The Scottish sort of combined hybrid first past the post plus proportional representation sort of regional system makes it very difficult to get a majority. The regional list vote, actually, I don't have the exact algorithm in front of me, but it sort of works against the parties that have done better in the sort of seat by seat votes. So it makes it harder, although the SNP have done it once before. So I think it'll be a minority SNP government with numerous Greens that also believe in independence. So that'll be a pro-independence majority in Scotland. I don't know what's going to happen in Wales. Currently the polls have Plaid Cymru in the lead, with Reform's numbers actually slightly in decline over the last month or so. And the Northern Ireland election was a couple of years ago. So with a Reform England, an SNP Green Scotland, a Plaid Cymru Wales, and largest party Northern Ireland being Sinn Féin. Is that a United Kingdom? I don't know. But you viewers, you sort of tell me what you think. Wee bit out of breath marching up here. But next, the politics, right. Tell me, what is going on with the current American administration? So, back in the day, myself and my brother, we were big nerds. I'm still a big nerd. I've been playing a lot of Warhammer recently. But that's the thing, that is a game, right? So, which leads me to, back in the day, used to play a lot of Command & Conquer, Medieval Total War, things like that, right? Games, they're fun. You know what's not fun? Real war, okay? So, what has been happening since the turn of the year? Okay, so, into December, January, we had a lot of nonsense from somebody has poured a tonic into Trump's ear, and him and his lackeys are saying things like Western Hemisphere and superpower and things like that. So I've noticed that they've toned down the Western Hemisphere nonsense, because obviously just a month or so ago you had Trump and his cronies trying to annex Greenland, which was interesting since it is actually the territory of a NATO member. Now, after what I was just talking about, I understand that a lot of Greenlandics people want independence. Totally understand that. At this moment, they are part of the Kingdom of Denmark, which is a NATO ally. So, and I think that, so I'm all for if countries want independence. That's up to them. I think that in this very small case, it might have worked out better because they're under the umbrella of NATO. I think a lot of people, it sounds like even some top military people in the States were warning the administration that this is not the way to go. You're turning allies into enemies here, which is a wider path that the Trump administration has been on, turning allies to enemies. I think that the ability to say no to Trump just unleashes sort of a type of kind of toddler, narcissistic rage pattern, which we've seen before with Zelensky being booted out of the White House. I believe that the South African president or prime minister was, given a lot of the same treatment. But so after being denied in his conquest of Greenland, And I think this is an interesting point, actually. I've seen a few people talk about, like, Mercator maps and the size differential on those maps, and Greenland possibly not being quite as big as what Trump thinks it is. And it's all about, with him, it's about, like, the image, isn't it? Gold. Every time you see the Oval Office, there's more gold in it. And he's building he's demolished half the White House to build these stupid ballroom thing. So it's all about size and prestige, isn't it? We're going to conquer this enormous island. Like 60,000 people live on it because it's basically an ice sheet. So he got denied in there because everybody told him it was a bad idea. Europeans grew a bit of a backbone and sort of came together on that, which is going to bring me into another topic. But if we think he didn't get what he wanted there, so he's sort of threw the dummy out the pram, and he basically did regicide in Venezuela by sending sort of American special forces in, kidnapping Maduro, overthrowing the Venezuelan government, and basically target a cruise missile onto the head of the next person in line, saying, "You better do what we tell you." So that was all his Western Hemisphere chat, wasn't it? He's threatening Cuba just now. He still calls the Prime Minister of Canada Governor Carney, which at Davos, Carney rocked it with a great speech about pursuing sort of shared interests and goals, standing up to great powers, sort of the middle powers of the world coming together. Very interesting. And I think that it's an interesting thing, isn't it? At university you study your craft, you study your profession to prepare you for the working world. You almost wonder, like, it wasn't university. Carney was not Governor Carney, Prime Minister Carney was the governor of the Bank of England during Brexit. So he had to listen to a lot of sort of, blue sky thinking from the likes of Boris Johnson and his cronies. So he's kind of got a crash course, a bit of a sort of module in how to deal with like absolute like nonsense, really. So I think that one, I wonder if that stood Mark Carney in good stead when he had to deal with the sort of the most unstable hyperpower leader that we've had for some time. So I think that was an interesting one. So he's conquered Venezuela, but then can't be bothered to really do anything about it. It took Maduro out. Not 100% sure why. There was lots of blowing up Venezuelan fishing boats and things like that. Some threats to Colombia, if I recall correctly. So threatening Colombia, conquering Venezuela. I believe on his Wikipedia, Trump even he was president of Venezuela, according to him, for a little while. And he's talking about Cuba, threatening Canada. Every now and again, he sort of forgets about it, but then he comes back and says that America needs the Panama Canal. So that's an interesting one. I think he's just obviously got bored. And it's interesting, I actually heard Trump himself say, people said, Trump will get bored with it and move on, talking about the Iran situation. Because, interestingly enough, Venezuela hasn't been enough for him. Many world leaders sort of decapitating the government of another country and figuring out what you're going to do might be like more than a 2-3 week project. But he obviously has just decided that he's just going to attack Iran on a whim. Now it's interesting, a lot of the chat coming out of the States, because some people, I don't know if this is true or not, people are saying that Trump's done it to distract from the Epstein stuff. Now if that is the case, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I don't know if that's true or not, but let's just, to even consider that might be the case is grotesque. And the fact that tens of thousands of people may die because of this new Gulf War that Trump has done. So he sort of launched attacks in tandem with Israel. Some even in his own administration wonder if he's dancing to Netanyahu and Co.'s tune on this, because Israel said, I believe, that they were going to do it anyway, and Trump and Co. have joined in. But let's just think for a minute, if he has done this to distract from his name possibly coming up in the Epstein things, this is like that Is there a worse abuse of power that you could possibly do? I don't know. You know, I think many people that have young kids would be horrified at what happened to a girls' school in the south of Iran. Up to 200 people dead, and like, you know, these are kids that didn't have to die. You know, a great many people are being hurt and injured in the Middle East and across the Gulf right now, and you kind of wonder what's it all about. And I don't even think in the States there's been sufficient explanation of why. I forget the gentleman's name. Trump's sort of one of his top security and terrorism advisors quit yesterday, saying that Iran was not a threat to the United States, and he felt that the current administration really needed to reverse track on what they were doing, which is interesting coming from any politician. And I'm sorry I can't remember the gentleman's name. I believe he was a sort of true believer of Trumpism in general up until this point. But from what I read about the guy, he is ex-special forces who's done tours in Iraq, and a CIA agent, and I believe his other half was killed in action as a CIA agent in the Middle East. So it seems to me that you have someone who might know what they're talking about a little bit more than Donald Trump on this, and he doesn't believe that the current American policy is of any sound value. So I think that what I talked about with games earlier on, so some strategy games, so I think it's interesting because I think that whether it's games, history, games is not a good source of sort of historical knowledge, but one thing that came up, I mentioned medieval Cold War before, and quotes used to come up on the loading screens when you're in between your battles on that. And it's interesting because I think this reflects quite well on the current situation. It was a quote from Machiavelli that said, like, wars begin when you will, but they do not end when you wish. So Trump has said that this war's won already, and then it's done. And actually, no, we might go on for another few weeks. And he said to other allies, he's threatened, he's belittled Keir Starmer quite a lot, the UK Prime Minister, you know, quite a fair bit on this, and saying that, you know, Keir's a good guy, but he's not helping us out, and saying that, oh, we don't need the Royal Navy ships. And actually, you know what, we need ships we need an aircraft carrier from France and Britain, and we need other NATO countries to help us out, and we need ships from China and Japan and South Korea. And it's madness, really. I mean, like, you know, I believe that Trump is stripping American military assets from Japan and Korea and redeploying them to the Middle East. He has, I don't know how many times he's threatened China and said that they're an adversary. I think that he wants these countries to now help him. And how many times he's belittled Europeans, he said that they're weak. He's saying that Starmer, he's no Winston Churchill. And I think this is an interesting thing. He starts this war out of nowhere. Has no idea what he is doing. He's now, whether it's true or not, if they were kind of strong-armed into it by sort of Israeli policy, I don't know. But it looks like that now because he doesn't have a goal. There is no purpose. There's no, you know, there's no outcome. So, I mean, Khamenei is gone. So the Supreme Ayatollah, he's finished. He's away. The next guy might be gone as well. I think that at what point do the Americans stop? So he started this war, but as Machiavelli says, he has no idea when it's going to stop, which it says a lot, really. But on the belittling Starmer thing, this begins to tie into and maybe a bit on the Greenland topic as well. Well, actually quite a lot on the Greenland topic. It was interesting exchange. I seen the Irish viewers can tell me if I'm wrong on the pronunciation. Is it the Chusiak, the Irish Prime Minister, Michael Martin, was in Washington on St. Patrick's Day talking away to Trump about Irish-American trade, and obviously there's a lot of Irish-American history and things like that. Shipping up to Boston, etc., down to you know, Chicago River, Green, all these things. And Trump lambasted Starmer in front of Martin. And this is a topic that Trump does, actually, just to excuse me, a little sort of sidetrack. Quite often you'll have like people like, remember the Juventus football team were there and Trump was ranting and raving about bombing Iran, or you know, People would get invited into the Oval Office to be talk to the president or be given medals, and then Trump will just randomly start talking about bombing countries or his general grievances with everybody. So he decided to rant and rave about Keir Starmer, and amusingly enough, Scottish windmills, I believe that was a thing. So he ranted and raving about Keir Starmer, saying he was no Winston Churchill. Now, Michael Martin was very gracious here. I was impressed, because Churchill was probably no friend to the Irish, really. He had, black and tans and all that kind of thing. When the Irish were sort of secession from the British Empire. But Michael Martin, he stood up and he said, he didn't figuratively do it. He said, well, I believe that Keir, he's a sort of earnest and humble man. You've got on with him before. He's a genuinely good person, and I think you can get on with him again. So he didn't totally tell Trump off, but he shut him down. He shut him down on, putting Keir Starmer down when he wasn't there to defend himself. Now, obviously, you can maybe tell I don't completely agree with a lot of the way that the British government is run or whatever, but I think that Starmer has probably done the right thing in this situation. And this kind of goes on to the next topic. So Michael Martin's obviously the leader of Ireland, Starmer the leader of the UK, which is out with the European Union at this time. But I think that once the European leaders grew a backbone and stood up to Trump in regard to the Greenland thing, and that was, I think that might have been the straw that broke the camel's back with a lot of situations here, right? Because, will Europe be great again? Now, let's not hope that we go into a new era of European colonialism. I don't think anybody wants that. But I believe that, Denmark is a country with a population of 5-6 million, threatened by the US of annexing their territory, that they believe it's there. It sounds to me like is it Frederiksen, like the Danish Prime Minister? It seems like the Danish government are quite protective over Greenland, and not just for their own sovereignty, but they're trying to protect Greenlandic people as well from sort of being, whatever the Americans could do to the place. And I think that lots of Europeans realise that, the days of appeasement with Trump are over. You can try and flatter him, you can try and appease him. It does not work. He's not interested in that. The only people it's quite different, comparing the likes of Denmark to China. But Xi in China, he has none of Trump's nonsense. He's quite sort of stone-faced when Trump sort of talks to him. China doesn't back down from trade wars. Now, obviously, the two largest economies in the world, they can kind of go toe to toe. But I think a lot of the Europeans realise, the Chagos Islands things where Trump has flipped and flopped on American policy on that, and the British government are trying to give it back to the Maldives. And Starmer's been called weak. I believe this was started under the Tories, actually, so it wasn't even a Labour policy. But Europeans in general have realised we can't rely on the Americans. The Americans have sold out on the Ukrainians as well as regards to the war against Russia. I believe the Americans are now not supplying military hardware directly, and it's only Europeans that are doing that. There's either Europeans are supplying their own gear or they're buying American war gear and giving it to Ukrainians. I believe there's still some intelligence sharing, but Trump basically doesn't like Zelensky, so that's that as regards to the American help on there. So it seems like that then you've got the Iran thing where Trump is sort of at the different times of the day, whether his sugar's getting a bit low or something, time for a new chicken nugget. But he just sort of flip and flops and says, we want European navies to help us or we don't. And I think that, the German Chancellor said, this has nothing to do with NATO. What are you talking about? It's the defensive alliance. And, Europeans in general they're securing, I believe that Greek and French ships have been sent to secure Cyprus, which is pretty embarrassing from a British perspective because Britain has several large, Akrotiri, and there's another large base on Cyprus, sovereign British territory that's supposed to be there for defence. And one of the Type 45 destroyers was sent, but I believe it's still not there yet, so it's air defence. So Greek and French Navy ships have secured sort of Cyprus being the closest kind of EU territory or European territory to the war zone, and that there's British fighter jets securing, helping with the Jordanian and Qatari airspace, things like that. But in general, they are not, European countries are not interested in becoming involved in a new sort of American crusade across the Gulf. And I think that that's the right policy. I think that, people here have got no stomach for it. I'm not too sure the American public do either. And even his own base, I think across the magosphere, some people are beginning to question, why. Lots of people don't think that Iran was a healthy regime, and they've shown that they weren't, and there are protests in the early part of 2026 slaughtering people in the street. So I don't think anybody is mourning the demise of that brutal regime. But at the same time, this is not, it's as the additional characters in The Hobbit say, this is not our fight. And I think that that's the right thing. And Europe seemed to come together on this. But with the Greenland thing, standing up to the Americans and realising how unpredictable that they are. With Canada buying into the sort of European defence and procurement sort of deals. And the UK initially being at loggerheads on that, but now coming closer to securing an agreement on that, and cooperating more closely with European militaries. Macron and the French military have been talking about expanding their nuclear umbrella across Europe, as in sort of their deterrent. I think that it's an interesting thing. I mean, I am fundamentally opposed to nuclear weapons. I don't think that they help the world in any way. But Europeans seem to want to come together and sort of realise that we're in a kind of multipolar world at this time, and it's only going to become more multipolar as things go. With sort of Russian aggression in Ukraine. I think Russian aggression probably will continue until there's no more Vladimir Putin, whether he steps aside or he dies or he leaves or whatever. I think that the rise of China. China's quite isolationist now. Who knows what will happen in the future? India will become a major economic power in the future. Population explosions in Africa, doubling or quadrupling the African sort of population in this century. So I think Europe is realising, with many small countries wanting to pull together. The European Union looked like it was on shaky ground after Brexit, but it could be a new Union of Europe. And that's the thing. I think it ties in. I think it's interesting what my wife said. She thought that Scottish people feel more European than British. I think that I would sincerely like to see Scotland rejoin the European Union. I think that would be a very important thing to do. I think that whether you want to call it a federalised Europe or Commonwealth of Europe, it's more integrated EU. But it's interesting, and I don't think that European nations in general would be pulling together more closely if it wasn't for the unpredictability of Trump and his sort of command and conquer-esque sort of policy, his headless chicken ideas, his starting wars when he wills but not ending when he wishes sort of thing. But remember, guys, he should have got the Nobel Peace Prize. So there's a lot of politics going on, so much politics. I think, and allow me sort of a big riposte back to what I did at the start. It's interesting because I think that if you end up with a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament come the end of spring, right, and then they ask for an independence referendum, again, because we've had the Supreme Court ruling, was it 2022? I believe the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom said that the Scottish Parliament can't declare a Scottish independence referendum, that they need the permission of Westminster. Then that becomes interesting, because a lot of if you get a pro-independence elected government of Scotland, I don't just mean a minority government. I mean there's a majority of people in there that are supporting independence. Then, and it's 2026. That's 12 years after 2014 when we had the last one. So, you know, people say a generation. Like, you've got like 12-year-olds now who were born when that was a thing. You know, at what point is it a union of nations and that we're not just colonised, effectively? Like, I think, you know, historically, if we go back, what was it? The Union of the Crowns, 1603, who James the First of England, who was paradoxically James the Sixth of Scotland, because he was already the King of Scotland, became the monarch across, became King of Scotland, England and Ireland. And then the sort of, talking about Panama actually earlier, the disastrous Darien scheme, sort of almost a century later, that sort of bankrupted the Kingdom of Scotland and formed a closer sort of fiscal and political union in 1707 with the Active Union. But in what way do we, you know, there has to be, if it's a union of crowns, if it's an active union, at what point can you decide to separate if you're not allowed to hold your own independence referendum in a disunited kingdom? And that might seem, again, paradoxical to what we're talking about. This is what a lot of you know, anti-independence or, you know, pro-Brexit people were saying, like, so you want to leave the UK and join the EU? And you're like, well, a lot of European Union values are important to what people in Scotland want. We believe in sort of you know, cooperation and economic prosperity, and not just, well, what the guys that believe in Brexit and reform voters would believe. I believe that they're chasing a sort of fantastical image of the UK or England that no longer exists. So it's interesting. I think all these things are interconnected. So we've got the disunited kingdom, Trump's command and conquer, making Europe great again. What do you think is going to happen by the summer, guys? Very curious to hear your thoughts below. And please like and subscribe. I've never said that before. Like and subscribe. Oh, the politics.